Hello, and welcome to On My Shelf. Today I'm talking about a fascinating adult nonfiction book about a woman whose dark yet inspirational journey contributed to the fight for women's rights and the rights of mental hospital patients. The Woman They Could Not Silence, One Woman, Her Incredible Fight for Freedom, and the Men Who Tried to Make Her Disappear, by Kate Moore, is the story of Elizabeth Packard, a housewife and mother of 6 whose husband of 21 years committed her to an insane asylum in 1860 after she expressed different religious beliefs and political beliefs than he had. It follows the history of women's rights during a time period when they could be committed to mental institutions by their husbands, fathers, brothers, or other men in their lives, simply for arguing or expressing a different opinion or showing any sort of intelligence or aptitude for anything but keeping the house. Elizabeth experiences terrible conditions inside the Illinois State Hospital in Jacksonville, Illinois, and comes head-to-head with the hospital overseer, Dr. Andrew McFarland. While there, she learns she is not the only sane woman kept in the institution. There are many who are conveniently labeled insane, so their voices are silenced. No one fights for their freedom, so Elizabeth vows to, and she does. Kate Moore is also the author of Radium Girls, The Dark Story of America's Shining Women, which I have not read, but after reading this one, it's definitely on my list, and I'm eagerly awaiting its arrival. I enjoyed many parts of The Woman They Could Not Silence. The first was, it's nonfiction that reads like fiction. Kate Moore has a way with words. She uses them to make this nonfiction book not feel like a nonfiction book. There were no tedious passages. It was all engaging prose. I found myself flying through the book, and that's a gift of her style. I read the audiobook version, but I found myself looking for other opportunities to read it because it was so hard to put down. I also enjoyed the story of an unknown woman. So often we hear the same names spoken again and again in relation to the women's movement. I love that Kate Moore found someone who, at first glance, seemed to be on the periphery, mostly because a lot of the documents she'd kept and the things she'd done were erased by the men who tried to silence her. But this book brings her to the forefront again and honors the work she did for the women's movement and to expose injustices that still exist today. She was a woman ahead of her time who laid the groundwork for the women's rights movement. I also really enjoyed the women's issues and history in the book. It was so interesting and disturbing to read about what was going on in the 1860s, right as the women's movement was getting started. These historical issues are important to remember. There are some parallels in what we see today. More on that later. But we can't forget these times in history, and I love that Kate Moore shone a light on this phenomenon where women were being committed to insane asylums just for speaking up about their rights. And they had no rights, so they couldn't get themselves out. The world was threatened by them, so it had to silence them. It's a cautionary tale that didn't end well for the men who tried to silence them. I also really enjoyed the history of mental institutions that were woven into it. I've done extensive research on mental institutions, and yet I learned some things about what they were like in the late 1800s. From a craft perspective, there was a lot to like about this book. The first was diaries and letters and writings, oh my. To write this book, Kate Moore had to scour through Elizabeth Packard's journals and letters and all the writing she did while she was in the insane asylum. It was volumes of information. But she pulled it all together and wove it into a book that felt like Elizabeth Packard was writing it in real time. I think that's probably why it read like fiction, because Moore did so much research and had so much at her fingertips that she could confidently fill in all the blanks. The second craft piece I enjoyed is the story of the unknown woman. As mentioned before, I loved that Kate Moore chose a woman whose name is not typically associated with the women's movement. Elizabeth Packard faded from history because the influence and power of Dr. McFarland was so strong. But thanks to Kate Moore, she lives on again. I loved that Kate Moore pulled out the real story. And it made me wonder, how many other real stories are we missing? It's probably a lot, because Elizabeth Packard was not the only woman of her time, or any other time, who was silenced. The book was also filled with engaging prose. I have mentioned this before as well. It was a nonfiction book, but the prose was so engaging, you forgot you were reading a nonfiction book. When I visit schools, kids often tell me that their least favorite subject is history. If they could read books like this, it would probably be their favorite subject. History that reads like a textbook isn't engaging, but history that reads like a modern-day story is. It was one of my favorite pieces about this book. Well done, Kate Moore. So here's what we can learn from The Woman They Could Not Silence. Number 1, write nonfiction that reads like fiction. That doesn't mean it will be untrue, but there is room for dialogue, and dialogue in history is a lot of guessing, using historical documents, and making your best guesses to fill in the blanks. In this story, Elizabeth Packard kept journals, so Moore was able to use a lot of that. In other cases, there may not be much of that, but it reminded me not to be afraid to use my best guesses to fill in the blanks. The facts are still there. They're in the bones of the story, and a little imagination that honors those facts may be okay. Just not too much, because I'm a former journalist after all, and dialogue is supposed to be word for word. But maybe I can bend a little? Number 2, look for fascinating stories. I don't know the story of how Kate Moore came across the name Elizabeth Packard, but I bet there's a story about it. It reminded me to look for the fascinating stories in history, the people who aren't always mentioned, the small little asides that say this one person was there. It reminded me that if we follow our curiosity, we may end up with something completely unexpected and utterly fascinating. Ask the necessary questions, do the necessary work. Find the invisible people. And number 3, tie history into life today. There are always patterns to history. We don't usually learn our lesson the first time, and change takes a really long time. In the epilogue of this book, Kate Moore looked at some ways that women are still silenced by claiming they're crazy or insane or out of their minds. It hasn't gone away, and if we forget that history, we risk forgetting that we've been here before. This book reminds me that when I'm writing historical fiction or historical nonfiction, I need to look for the areas of intersection in the world today or in recent days. I need to remind readers that we haven't completely solved the problem and there's still work to be done. Because as long as injustice exists, our work is not finished. That's it for today's On My Shelf. If you're interested in hearing an author's perspective on books, movies, and sometimes TV shows, be sure to subscribe to my channel. And thanks for watching.